I'm Adam. I'm the Director of Programs at the Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources, and we're thrilled you're all here. We had a ton of applications for this exclusive virtual workshop, and so we feel like we picked a really good crop of reporters to spend 2 days exploring topics around land back. We are going to build some more time into the next session for introductions with all of our participants. So stay tuned on getting to know who all you're looking at. But for now, we just wanted to kick things off with an overview. And we have two amazing speakers to kind of set the stage for the rest of our workshop. We have Hayden King and Heather Whiteman Runsham. And I'm going to introduce them in a minute, but right before I do that, I'm going to give you some ground rules for how we conduct our virtual workshops. You are free to turn your cameras off during talks and things like that if you need to. We ask that when we come back into the Q&A portion of the session, that everybody show your faces. It's nice for our speakers to know they are, in fact, talking to other human beings and not just blank Zoom screens. You will ask questions when we open the floor by just typing the words, "I have a question" or "question" into the chat bar. We tried the whole little raising hands thing, and that is chaos, so we don't do that. That way I'm able to call on people in the order that they announce they have a question, so we have some semblance of moderation with our Q&A. But all of these sessions are being recorded and also transcribed, and those recordings and transcriptions will be made available to you after the workshop wraps up. I don't know that I need to say this, but we're going to, especially with AI and everything, it is the responsibility of all of you to verify the accuracy of transcriptions. I especially have a feeling during these 2 days that there will be some language and words that the AI struggles with. It can't even get our name right often, so just make sure you do your due diligence on that. And then finally, there is a way if you need captions. I think that was an option. That was a question someone asked. If you go to the bottom of this screen and click the little more box, there is a option to turn captions on if you need it during the session. And I think I've covered everything. Oh, and also you will get everyone's contact information on the conclusion of the workshop so you can follow up with all of our speakers. So I think that's all you need to know for now. I will introduce our speakers and then turn the floor over to them. And here we go. So we have Hayden King. Hayden King is an Anishinaabe from Beausoleil First Nation on Chimnessing. He's the executive director of Yellowhead Institute and an associate professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. His research and analysis revolves around Indigenous assertions of land rights and responsibility in both historic and modern treaty contexts. And he's the co-author of the Yellowhead Institute Red Paper, Land Back. King has also taught at McMaster and Carleton Universities, held fellowships at the Conference Board of Canada and Massey College, and is the recipient of a Governor General's Meritorious Service Medal. So Hayden, thanks for being here. We're glad you could join us. And then Heather Whiteman Runsham is a citizen of the Apsallaka Crow Nation. She's the director of the Tribal Justice Clinic, an associate clinical professor at University of Arizona's Rogers College of Law, where she teaches courses on tribal water rights, tribal courts, and tribal law. Before joining the university, Heather worked as an attorney at the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder, Colorado, advocating for the rights of Indigenous peoples to water, land, and self-determination, and also as an in-house attorney for her own tribe. She serves as a judge on the Southwestern Intertribal Court of Appeals, a member of the Arizona Civil Rights Advisory Committee, a board member of the Agua Caliente Water Authority, and as the North American representative on the Indigenous Coordinating Body of Enhanced United Nations Participation for Indigenous Peoples. So we have some truly impressive folks joining us to kick this off, and I'm glad they could find time in their busy schedules to talk to all of us. So I believe Hayden is going to go first, and I will stop talking now, and you guys can hear from the people you actually wanted to show up and hear from. So thanks, Hayden.
Thank you, Adam, and thanks for the invitation to be here with all of you. I've been doing this work for about 15 years, but I started my career angrily responding to newspaper columns and reporting and op-eds in Canadian newspapers that framed Indigenous people as, you know, backwards or savage or whatever awful tropes were used at the time, and wrote dozens of responses, mostly op-eds in the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and Toronto Star. So I've been doing a lot of media engagement over the years, and it's pretty remarkable how things have changed. You know, from being one of the only Indigenous voices in the Canadian media to now, you know, an overwhelming group of us doing this work, and it's to the point in the Canadian context, at least, that you know you get so many media requests a day that you can't keep up. So it's been interesting to see how the landscape has changed in a Canadian context, at least, and the fact that I'm invited to this discussion to speak with you all, I think, reflects that fact. And as I said, I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to talk about my work with the Yellowhead Institute and especially Landback. Um, if you don't know our organization, we've been around for 7 years. We're an Indigenous-led, technically we're a research and education center based at a university. We're largely pretty independent, but we have that tie to the university. And we produce, we're pretty prolific. We produce weekly, twice monthly rather, sort of short, what we call policy briefs, which are kind of op-ed style perspectives on current developments and Indigenous issues, mostly in Canada, but actually in the United States and globally as well. We publish special reports 4 times a year on a range of issues, from criminal justice to language revitalization to climate change, a northern economy. Our latest special report was on Inuit conceptualizations of economic development. And we also produce a variety of you know, toolkits, interactive maps, PowerPoint presentations communities can use to educate their citizens, comics, podcasts, um, and red papers as well, which are comprehensive research projects that usually take 2 to 3 years to produce. Most of the work that we do at Yellowhead is community led, in the sense that our small team uh, either has an existing relationship or develops relationships with specific communities and works with them to refine a concept, an idea, a pressing issue that's affecting their community or communities, and we work with them through the process to produce research. And one of the red papers, actually technically our first, but really our second red paper, was Landback, and we call them red papers in responses to the common approach to new policy proposals or innovations that are often called white papers. So from an Indigenous perspective, what's an Indigenous manifesto? What's an Indigenous response to that? And so these are our red papers, and we publish Landback, Cashback, and we're working on one on care at the moment, and reproducing our sort of social worlds, which in some ways is couched within how we conceptualize Landback as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the work that we did and the report that we produced, and how we think about Landback. But I really don't think I'm going to say too much. I would much prefer to have a conversation with you all. But I can give you an overview of what we did and how we did it and what we found. So when we started out working on the idea for Landback, it started actually sort of as a technical conversation. Like, well, what are the legal mechanisms? What are the policy mechanisms? What are communities doing on the ground to assert their jurisdiction in these like technical ways? And we reached out to 25 Indigenous practitioners, leaders, advocates, And we pitched this idea and we said, come to Toronto and let's just sit down for, a couple of days, 2, 3 days, and sit and talk about these issues. And what I think was a little bit surprising to us is that people came and they didn't center the material restitution of land in the conversation. It was way more holistic than that. We wanted to talk about the regulatory regime, and they wanted to talk about patriarchy and how social dynamics in communities infringe on people's ability to access the land. So certainly we have these institutions and structures in a Canadian context, but I think in American context as well, which deny Indigenous access to the land. But we also have these dynamics in our own communities that have been inherited, that make these efforts to both get land back and access to the land more challenging. And so we came very early to think of land back as the return of Indigenous land and life, as Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang very eloquently put it. It's not just the material, tangible transfer of land back to Indigenous people, which is definitely part of it, but you cannot undertake that work without restoring the elements of Indigenous life that animate our relationships to the land. And so our conceptualization of land back is so much more broader than merely restitution. And I think in a lot of ways, this flows from our relationships to the land. As a treaty scholar myself, researching treaties and involved in my own community's work at trying to get our treaties honored, it's really, I think, fascinating to go back into the archives, and we just did this for a treaty map that we produced, and really reflect and learn what Indigenous negotiators were saying in those early treaties about how these were agreements to share the land. These were about mutual autonomy, about mutual respect, ensuring that our wood piles will always be full, ensuring that relationship for as long as the world stands, as Yellowhead said. Um, and these early treaties, from treaties that we negotiated with the land itself, the treaties that we still subscribe to with the deer and the moose, to the treaties that we made with each other, to the treaties with settlers, they enshrine these principles of shared sovereignty. And when you start looking into the negotiated treaties with Canada, you start to see the same language, the same metaphors that are used. Like we're all in the dish, and we share a spoon to eat out of the bowl, and our common obligation is to ensure that the bowl never runs dry. We took these principles and incorporated them into treaties with the British, with the Dutch, the French, and the Canadians and Americans as well. And of course, settlers had their own interpretation of treaties and often overwrote Indigenous interpretations of treaties. And I mentioned the archives because you go back and you see the transcriptions of these treaty negotiations, and you have this very clearly defined Indigenous interpretation of the treaty and this very clearly defined settler interpretation of the treaty, and then this very clearly defined overwriting of the settler or overwriting of the Indigenous interpretation of treaties with settler interpretations. So land back you come to realize, we came to understand, we came to realize through this work that the principles with which Indigenous people approach treaty making in those early relationships, were recorded, they were legitimate, they were authentic. So when we talk about land back today, often I think the narrative is that it's a bit like revisionist, we're doing revisionist history here, like and Native people never had a concept of land ownership, or Native people surrendered or extinguished their title to land, but that's not what early treaty narratives reflect. And so this process, this malinterpretation of treaties, is one of a handful of mechanisms by which Indigenous people were dispossessed of the land. Of course, in addition to this malinterpretation of treaties, we have the rise of residential schools, which I think some have argued fairly persuasively were mechanisms to remove people and children from the land and sever that relationship with their communities to more easily allow settler access to lands and resources, the creation of reserves and the settlement of native people, as policymakers publicly said, to convince indigenous people to stop roaming and occupy the land that was needed for lumbering, mining, agriculture, and a variety of other mechanisms that we note in the land back report were deployed to just get native people off of the land, and this gave rise to the establishment of provinces and territories and legislatures and judiciaries and a criminal justice system, which, as Lisa Ford writes, is really the mechanism by which colonization can get a foothold through the criminal justice system. And then, of course, we see indigenous people, when trying to access their land, become criminalized, right? Um, Native people were not able to gather in numbers larger than 3 off of the reserve, required permission to leave the reserve, to access the land for hunting, et cetera, et cetera. So this entire legal infrastructure emerges and is established and deployed in a Canadian context to sever those original relationships to the land that Native people once possessed and advocated for, both in treaties and in their own relationships. And a testament to the strength of those relationships was the fact that Indigenous people did not stop protesting their interpretation of what the relationship was supposed to be. We had people going to London, we had people going to Geneva, we had, all manner of protests, so much so that in 1923, Canada banned protests, Indigenous peoples protesting the seizure of land. But this resistance eventually did pay off in some ways, I think. We had a number of court decisions that slowly, very incrementally opened up the space for Indigenous people to start exercising jurisdiction to their lands and resources. And probably we started to see this trend in the post-war era, but in 1973, there was a court case called the Calder decision that recognized Aboriginal title for the first time. And the Supreme Court in Canada, suddenly said, well, if Canadians are occupying land where no treaty exists, where no title has been surrendered, then they're occupying it illegally. And Canadians, of course, aghast, realized that something had to be done and began a new era of treaty making. And that launched a canon of Aboriginal law, including the concept of Aboriginal rights. And this is all owing to Indigenous people's resistance and pushing back against the malinterpretation of treaties and malinterpretation of Indigenous relationships to the land and dispossession more generally. And so Indigenous people have taken these legal gains and exploited them. And so we see slowly, in a policy context, in a legal context, the space opening up for Indigenous people to exercise jurisdiction. One of those innovations has been the duty to consult in the Canadian context, whereby any development that might affect an established or asserted treaty right or Aboriginal right, governments have to go and talk to the Native people and say, hey, we're planning this transmission line through your territory or this natural gas pipeline. What do you think about it? Can we, negotiate some kind of an agreement? Now, the law says that you don't have to get consent. You just have to consult. If you consulted in a degree that a court would say was sufficient, then the development can still proceed, even if the Indigenous group opposes the development. And so we talked a lot about this in the red paper Land Back, about some of these sort of crumbs of recognition, whereby this resistance became too powerful or annoying. I don't know what the adjective is to describe it. Whereby Canada could simply no longer refuse it and began to offer these things like the duty to consult and impact benefit agreements and specific and comprehensive land claims, these forms of redress to try to fix what had gone sideways over the past 150 years. And so in the red paper, we talk about the limitations of some of these sort of differentiated rights, some of these gestures of reconciliation And we produced this map that shows mining claims in Canada from 1982 to the present. And I didn't include it here, but maybe I can share it afterwards. 1982 is instructive because it was the year that Aboriginal rights became enshrined in the Constitution, really like 1982 to 1985. And then from then into the present, we have this thickening heap of judicial decisions expanding or limiting, depending on your interpretation, Aboriginal rights. But at the same time, we mapped the proliferation of mining claims. And from 1982 into the present, there's this significant expansion of resource development in Indigenous territories. And so the two actually march side by side, the expansion of Indigenous rights and the expansion of resource development in Canada and particularly the North, to the point that Indigenous people really started to become overwhelmed with these consultation requests. You get a dozen letters in the mail every day saying, "Hey, we're building this pipeline. Hey, we're doing this housing development." Um, and so at our gathering with the folks that we talked to and post gathering, we started to realize pretty quickly that all of these gestures were really just ways to absorb Indigenous people into development processes. So let's create joint ventures, let's create procurement contracts, let's create agreements with communities that provide some sort of resource revenue. But again, they all none of them, by and large, went any ways towards restoring those relationships to the land that Indigenous people had been advocating for the past 2 centuries. Instead, it was just really like absorbing them into um, the common sense approach to development in Canada. And so as Indigenous people subscribe to, yeah, okay, well, let's buy a stake in your pipeline. Now we have an incentive to make sure as much oil as possible is pumped out of the ground and shipped to the United States. And so tremendous amount of criticism began to emerge in communities, and I think a pretty fair divide, and I think something that the media has difficulty grappling with is the so-called sort of factions in communities. um, some that support pipeline development, some that are opposed. But the folks that we work with, by and large, we're not necessarily saying we're not interested in development, but we want to ensure that the development happens on our terms. So let's take the duty to consult, for instance. Well, as I already mentioned, the duty to consult doesn't ensure consent. It just says we're going to let you know this is happening and try to bring you into the process. But even if you oppose, we're going to proceed with it. So concepts like the free, prior, and informed consent, where communities impacted by development on their own territories can actually say, no, we're not interested, and then have governments recognize that. So folks that we work with really advocated for models of consent, and models that were sort of unique to the standard United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples free, prior, and informed consent, models that were more community-based, legitimate, uh, um, and ongoing, not sort of like a one-time thing. We approve this development, but a sort of steady stream of communication throughout the life of the project and thereafter. And so in some ways, this is like a framework, right? Let's approach this relationship with this consent-based framework. And not to, I don't think it would be a surprise to anyone that governments, provincial, federal, territorial, didn't support the argument that Indigenous people were making. And so we started to see, I think in the past 10 years, land back emerge in practice. So I guess it's important to say, like, land back is not a new phenomenon, right? I mean, this historic trajectory I'm sketching is something that has endured for centuries. And the land back movement that we're talking about today is sort of like the contemporary manifestation of it, this contemporary manifestation of maybe the oldest demand in Canadian history, right, for the return of Indigenous land. But we've really started to see it emerge and be manifest in practice, building off of those gains that have been made in courts and policy frameworks. And so you have communities across the country that are going out, like the Chilcotin or the Silcotin, that are saying, we're going to create our own moose hunting permits. We're going to create our own mushroom harvesting permits. And anyone that comes into our territory that wants to participate in those activities has to get our permission first and has to get a form they have to carry around. And they might have something from the province, but we're not going to recognize that. And we'll deploy guardians onto the land to kick them out of our territory if they don't have our consent. To the Sepwetmak tiny house warriors who build housing on the line of the Trans Mountain Pipeline in interior British Columbia, providing this service to the community while also asserting their jurisdiction and trying to stop a pipeline. The Helsuk Marine Response Unit, a diesel oil spill in their community that nobody decided to clean up, so they had to take it upon themselves and clean it up, and then they established their own environmental marine response unit in response, and now patrol their own waters. And these examples are numerous. I think, catalog 8 of them in the land back report, but they're examples where Indigenous people are not just asserting their relationships and their rights to the land, but they're actually enforcing those assertions, and they're doing it outside of existing policy or regulatory or legal frameworks, because they're breathing life into their own laws, their own frameworks, their own governance practices that have been in existence, obviously fragmented for millennia, and draw on some of the principles that I mentioned earlier around treaty making. So these examples, I think, we saw at Yellowhead Institute, and we wrote the report 5 years ago now, are only proliferating. And so what you see happening in Canada is this emergence of a parallel sovereignty. So certainly provinces, the federal government, Canada, are the permitter, the licensor, the permitter. They decide what happens on Crown lands, which is, from an Indigenous perspective, Indigenous lands. But increasingly, it's Indigenous people that are saying, no, actually, we have the say in what happens in our lands, and we're going to operationalize our processes and compel industry, governments, citizens to abide by it. And
so Hayden, I hate to cut you off. Well, I want to make sure we have time for Heather and some questions. Yes. So that might be a good place to pause and cue it up for Heather. Good. Okay, sorry about that.
Oh,
but I'm just trying to keep, that's all right. So Heather, if you want to go for it, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, I think that was a great start to the discussion that we're going to have. Thank you, Hayden, for giving us such a great rundown of a lot of really important work that your institute and the folks up in Canada have done over the years. And yeah, let me just see if I can pull up a slide or two here. I put together a couple slides more for my own benefit than for yours, because I tend to go off on tangents if I don't have like visual structure in front of me. So yeah, let's see. Okay, so I think that a lot of what Hayden said is relevant in the United States context too, for those of us who are on the what we call south end of what's often referred to in our communities as the medicine line, or the border between the United States and Canada. I want to follow up and just really emphasize the importance of history. And in my work over, I think, about 2.5 decades now of advocating on behalf of tribal nations in the United States court system, in policy arenas on this side, and in some international fora as well, that history plays such a key role, and that understanding and having the ability to utilize history to know where to find the right history is just so incredibly crucial to getting these stories right. I share Hayden's, I guess, history of frustration often with the press. There were times in my career when I absolutely would not take calls from media because they would never get it right. And I didn't want to be I didn't want to be on the record saying something that I hadn't actually said, or that what I said was taken out of context. Not always, you know, because of the reporter's like ill intent, but maybe because of their um, lack of training and perspective, and just not having the resources they needed at their command to get the story right and to have the background that they needed to report accurately and respectfully about the issues facing our communities. I think that's changed a lot in recent times, and it's encouraging to see that. But I just wanted to sort of lay these basic um, guidelines that it's impossible to analyze or accurately discuss current status of Indigenous and United States relations without having a thorough and balanced understanding of history. And, you know, what that means is that you, of course, have to go much further than the preparation that you're given through our formal education system in the United States. And it seems like those of us here in this Zoom room are probably all on the right track there. So, way to go. Um, Also want to remind everybody that history doesn't begin with contact. Um, Systems, norms, values, and relationships existed long before colonizers from other parts of the world came onto this continent. Our norms, values, and relationships in Indigenous communities existed from time immemorial. They were the product of our intimate relationships and knowledge of lands, waters, habitats, relatives, and the relationships that we had still hold ongoing significance and weight to this day. They may have been disrupted in some situations, but they continue to exist, and sometimes have not been disrupted, and that's important to acknowledge. Disruption, displacement, and disempowerment are part of what reconciliation is intended to remediate. Here in the United States right now, I think we're in a really interesting point where, you know, we've fought for years to have acknowledgement of the boarding school policy, and we've advocated for years that we need a reconciliation process, something like what happened in Canada, but maybe a little bit different. Um, but that, you know, before we can have reconciliation, we need acknowledgement, and we need access to the truth. We need acknowledgement of truth, and we can't move forward without having that thorough assessment and acknowledgement of history, and you know, a real apology from the United States probably would include some of these elements to much greater extent than what we've had to date from the outgoing administration, and from those preceding it. Relationships. I think that land back, when we're talking about land back, we're really talking about relationships. And it's important to bear in mind that every Indigenous people, every tribal nation, if that is the manifestation of an Indigenous people, is as a tribal nation, they each have their own unique set of norms, values, and systems in place that set forth what their relationships are and what sorts of duties exist to lands and waters. The treaties, and Hayden talked a lot about treaties, and I think that treaties are absolutely where most of these conversations should be starting. Many of our tribal nations in the United States made treaties with the United States. Not all, but many. The treaties are the key component to understanding what obligations exist on each side of the treaty with respect to lands and laws in our modern United States federal Indian law legal framework. In the case of water rights, there is the ability of tribes who did not make a treaty with the United States to assert claims for water, but generally water rights under federal Indian law in the United States are tied to a land base. And we can talk a little bit more about some of the problematic aspects of that that framework, and what it could maybe look like under some of the sort of transformative trends that we're seeing develop and gain some traction. So when we talk about water back, I wanted to talk about water a little bit on its own as well, under the federal Indian law framework again, and under property law in the United States. water is treated basically as a land appurtenant resource rather than as a component of life or something which is basically a human right. It's an element that's necessary for the sustenance of human life and other life as well. And that maybe we need to reassess that. You know, here in the United States, many tribal nations have successfully asserted their claims for legal rights to water through this federal Indian law framework and through a system that the federal government has laid out, that can respond to either litigation or negotiation between two sovereigns, between a tribal nation and the United States, often with input from stakeholders such as agricultural interests in the region, extractive industries that also are consumptive users of water, and state and local governments that also have some role in governing and regulating water use and relationships to water. That framework perhaps needs to shift, right? We know that, especially in the western part of the United States, we're in an area where there is an over allocation of scarce water resources which are becoming even more scarce as long-term droughts and climate change shift expected what I guess previously reliable patterns of precipitation and water recharge. We're in an era now where we can't necessarily rely on our decades of water data to provide us with the water that we need to continue past patterns which were maybe not well informed and not based on science. So water back is I think a new way of looking at how tribes relate to water, how tribes govern water, and how tribes ensure that they and their citizens have the access that they need to an increasingly scarce resource that is also increasingly valuable in financial terms. So here in the US, we have we have a number of examples in recent years of literal land back. So the literal return of title to land to Indigenous peoples, to either coalitions, federally recognized tribes, some unrecognized tribes who are recognized through other processes or by other sovereigns. We had, in California, a number of examples of land back. The city of Eureka returned land to the Wyatt tribe. The Esselen tribe, which previously had no title to land, was able to purchase land in Big Sur, California. If you understand some of the highly competitive property values in that region, you can understand the significance of a landless tribe being able to access a land base. Really significant. The Sinkyone Wilderness Council receiving land from the Save the Redwoods League in California. The Rappahannock tribe in Virginia, previously unrecognized tribe, recently achieving federal recognition, received donated land from the Chesapeake Conservancy. And finally, the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa purchasing some lands that had been forfeited through non-payment of taxes by the previous title holders, being able to expand their reservation land base in Minnesota. So those are some examples of literal land back, gaining or regaining title to ancestral lands. I'm going to skip those two for now. But I think it's interesting to think, though, about ways in which land back doesn't need to involve legal title in order to sometimes meet the goals and objectives of an Indigenous people. Getting land back can mean other things, right? It can mean that we restore a relationship, that the communities in which we continue to exist and the communities that exist around us re-acknowledge the significance of lands and resources to our peoples, where it had previously been denied through processes, through movements like Manifest Destiny, the assimilation policy of the United States. So these are all, ways in which land back doesn't have to look a certain way. It doesn't have to follow a specific pattern, right? Land back can mean returning and strengthening Indigenous languages. It can mean preserving, reigniting, restoring ceremonies, kinship practices, traditional leadership paradigms, health and medicinal knowledge, food sovereignty, agricultural practices, architecture, our standards for dwelling structures, the ways in which we place our dwellings without the oversight of the federal government and direction of the Housing and Urban Development Department under the federal government. So things like really just exercising full sovereignty over how we live, where we live, and the ways in which we build those futures for our children to follow going forward. So land back is about history, but it's also very much about the future, of course, and our ability to determine what a strong Indigenous future looks like for our own communities. All of these activities, of course, require that we have strong and vital relationships to our lands, our waters, our relatives, among the other types of creatures, living creatures and habitats, and that these relationships need to be governed, need to be founded very strongly within the laws and the norms of each of our tribal nations. I included here a picture of one of the newer welcome signs to the what was previously known as the National Bison Range, and now it's the Bison Range that is held for all intents and purposes by the Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Reservation in Montana. This is land that was carved out of their reservation and utilized as the federal bison range. We can talk for hours about the significance of the bison as a species that really, I think is instructive and demonstrates the ways in which our relationships to lands and waters have been compromised, have been inhibited in their growth in previous centuries, and that, the bison and the resurgence of the bison on the land and the newer support for bison restoration, reintroduction of bison to different ranges and habitats, and the acknowledgement of the role of the bison in a lot of areas where mainstream American society didn't acknowledge that they had existed prior to their near destruction by white America. This is really, I think, a demonstration, and it signifies for many of us that we are on the right path, that the trend, the energy is moving back the other way. The pendulum has shifted. We are restoring our relatives to their land, to our land, the land that we share, the land that we all have related to for millennia. So I think those are some of the elements of land back, and the ways that we are able to support that can go a number of different ways, right? We have the really strong roots in activism and grassroots activism that have driven so much of the land back movement and really have made it visible to much of mainstream America. We have also the long, sometimes decades long litigation processes that support and hopefully are consistent with the goals of grassroots efforts as well, right? Not as much fun to watch, not as whatever, great for photo ops, and not as catchy and interesting maybe for things like media. But all of these different efforts go to the same means, which is, again, returning and restoring resources, relationships, and that's all a big part of what land back is about. And it's about our future. It's about building Indigenous futures. We can utilize the law to help us get there. We can utilize other tools as well. A couple of great resources that I just want to point out to you. Hayden mentioned the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And, we have the two key articles in the Declaration, Articles 25 and 26, that really talk about Indigenous peoples' relations to lands and waters and other resources, and kind of put those goals and those standards forward very nicely and very, very concisely. Also mentioned free, prior, and informed consent. Other articles in the declaration go to free, prior, and informed consent. Articles 10, 19, and 28, I think, are the keys to looking at free, prior, and informed consent and sort of seeing the language in the UN Declaration. You know, the declaration is the product of decades of negotiation between member states and Indigenous peoples and the sort of bureaucracy within the United Nations itself to get to a place where we could agree on what words on a piece of paper could be moved forward and finally voted on and approved of by nearly all of the member states of the United Nations to set forth standards and to enunciate what the world believes is true and appropriate when it comes to the rights of Indigenous peoples. These are the pronouncements that emerged from that decades-long process and sometimes a very contentious set of negotiations over many years by many powerful individuals. So I would emphasize the importance and the significance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is the standard to which I think many of us seek to bring the fruits of our labor in our domestic law contexts at this point. We are working to domesticize the standards set forth in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples within the framework of federal Indian law. Obviously, there's a lot of transformation that needs to take place, a lot of daylight between what the federal government will acknowledge as its obligations and what the UN Declaration would set forth as its rightful obligations to Indigenous peoples. But we make progress with every little step forward and every new agreement in which the United States or other jurisdictions within the United States, states and local governments as well, accede to and agree to respect and acknowledge the jurisdiction of tribal nations over lands, resources, waters, and territories. So I think I've said enough, and I can pause there. And I think it would be great for us to have more informal conversation. Now I'm anxious to hear what questions people have.
All right, thanks, Heather and Hayden. We have some questions coming in already. So yeah, just let me know in the chat if you have a question. I'll call on you. I'll also, as long as Heather and Hayden can stick around a little beyond the hour, we can let this have 10 or 15 more minutes since it's the introductions, everything took a while and I talked too long. So Deb Kroll is showing everyone how it's done by asking a question before I even asked.
I just said when it's time.
Well, it's time, so go for it.
I believe it's mostly for Heather because we know a lot of the laws are different north of the medicine line than down here. You know, a lot of what's going on are both recognized and non-recognized tribes receiving land or being able to purchase land through the help of, excuse me, various environmental groups. In my reporting, I have found that unless you are capable of converting that land into trust land, that you generally have to abide by things like conservation easements and other public access requirements that really prevent the tribe from being able to use and access its ancestral lands to rebuild communities. For instance, Esalen, you know, they can put a roundhouse up, but they can't build a home there. They can't build even an off-grid home. A lot of those people, I'm just using them as an example, a lot of the tribal members have to live 3, 4, 5 hours away because they can't afford to live in their ancestral lands. And now they have this land and all they can do is you know, go do some control burns, you know, prescribe cultural burning. They can go pick some plants and they can have a ceremony. So they really don't have sovereignty over that land. So how do you see tribes being able to use these mechanisms and yet still be able to, at the end of the day, use those lands in a more appropriate way, with the goal of rebuilding community, rebuilding cultures, rebuilding nations.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important question. And in the case of tribes that don't have federal recognition, that's one of the huge challenges, right? Is you don't have the recognized attributes of a sovereign supported through a legal framework of the different relationships between state, tribal, and federal sovereigns. So that's a huge challenge. And I don't know if there's an easy answer to that other than asking the overarching colonizing sovereigns to provide a framework and a set of exemptions, a status through which you can do that. In some places that may be more feasible than in others, right? So California is within the process, and I think wrapping up a truth and reconciliation process of their own. That's absolutely something that the SLN should be advocating for, to be included in the set of recommendations coming out of the California Truth and Reconciliation process through those commissioners who are putting together that report and the recommendations that are supposed to accompany their full report on, the different challenges and issues and ongoing, commitments needed from the state of California to do right by Indigenous peoples. California is such an interesting example because that's a place where many treaties were negotiated and signed between federal representatives, taken back to Washington, D.C., hidden away, like literally locked away in a drawer for decades, never ratified by Congress. In the interim, California went through a series of initiatives to basically completely destroy any potential land title claims by Indigenous peoples through their state assembly, with the with the complete permission of the federal government.
You can say it genocide.
It was genocide. And,
Yeah.
this is one component of the genocide, right? Was establishing a process through which any claims under Mexican law could be asserted, and having a very, very discrete timeline during which that had to happen. It was a time when Indians were being actively hunted and killed, and requiring them to go to San Francisco and register their title claim within a 2-year or 5-year window. I can't remember which, but it doesn't matter because it was ridiculous and impossible. And after that, no further claims can be asserted. And that's how California tribes largely were completely divested of their land resources. It's an extreme example, but it really demonstrates, the shamelessness with which people were taken from their lands, from which lands were taken from their stewards. So yeah, that's one thing. There's no good answer there, right? But there are some processes underway that could help people get to a point where maybe they'll have access to get something into place. It's all of these things are processes, right? But we're making progress. I think it's just slow.
Thanks, Heather. And thank you, Deb and Odette, two IJNR alumni, for sharing some other tips on how this works. If you can try to have a very short preamble to your question, we will get through more questions. And you do not need to type your entire question into the chat. That is distracting to the conversation. So just let me know you have one and I will call on you. Serena is next.
Okay, I'll try to be quick with mine. Thank you both so much for just a really helpful overview and history and introduction. Hayden, this question is mainly for you, but if there's time, I'd be curious as to your thoughts too, Heather. I'm really interested in this idea and emerging concept of parallel sovereignty that you mentioned, Hayden, which I'm definitely seeing happen a lot in British Columbia with co-management of lands. And I'm currently researching a story about co-management of marine areas and marine protected areas. So my question is if you have any examples of, positive examples of parallel sovereignty or best practices of that, whether it is a colonial Indigenous relationship or maybe even an Indigenous example of parallel sovereignty? I'd love to hear what a good example would look like.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question, and it depends on the assumptions that we make. I mean, if I think in a lot of ways, reporting on Indigenous issues tends to be bound by the legal what's possible. If any activity taken by community is outside of the bounds of what are perceived as the law of the province or the federal government, then they're typically cast as illegal or unjustified. And so there's a level of tolerance there that has to be navigated. And in some ways, to answer this question, like I think about in BC, the Chilcotin have had their title or partial title to their lands recognized. And so what did they go and do with the 5,000 square kilometers that were recognized as title lands? They went and created a park, a tribal park. And they've got a policy framework, a regulatory framework, staff, and they're managing the park on their terms. It's on British Columbia's Crown land. So the Chilcotin have this declaration from the Supreme Court saying, actually, this is Chilcotin title lands, and now they're going and managing it. Meanwhile, the province is saying, oh, what do we do? Do we no longer have title over this Crown land? So within the bounds of legality in a Canadian context, that's like I think a fair example of this parallel sovereignty in operation. But I think co-management in some ways is the opposite of that, right? Like co-management is bringing Indigenous representatives onto a co-management board in a pre-existing institution, right? So national parks beyond tribal parks are a really good example of that, and you often see it in modern treaty contexts, like the Toongait National Park or the new marine park in Nunavut, where the Indigenous community has 2 or 3 representatives. They sit on a co-management board. Province has 2 representatives. Federal government has a representative. Often, it's Canada and the provinces that have a majority on these co-management boards. I think that's starting to shift to 50-50. Land use planning. No one talks about land use planning because it's this like obscure regulatory tool. But if you remember the Peel watershed decision in the Yukon, it was the failure of the land use planning regime that opened up the authority of the Indigenous communities there to manage it themselves. So co-management and land use planning, there's a potential there for parallel sovereignty, but often what happens is that Indigenous communities get co-opted into the existing institution. And then you have these really interesting examples, like in Labrador, the Innu went at the co-management board said you can't hunt caribou here, and then the Innu went and they hunted a bunch of caribou. And the media response was like, oh my God, these like savage Indians are overhunting the caribou. But the Innu were saying like, no, we've managed these caribou for thousands of years and we're going to continue to do it despite what this co-management board says. So, I mean, I could actually talk about co-management and land use planning all day, but I think they're actually different streams of sovereignty in a lot of ways.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hayden. Heather, did you have anything to add? Or I can go to the next question. Okay, Megan, go for it.
Okay. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for having me. This is actually, I just wanted to pick the brains of both Hayden and Heather real quick to explain. I am a journalist at the Denver Post, and I'm also Kanaka Oiwi, which is Native Hawaiian. So when I'm covering Indigenous communities, like right now I'm doing a story with the Ute Mountain Ute tribe in Southern Colorado. I know that as Indigenous people, we share a lot of the same issues like water rights, land access. In Hawaii, we deal with like the military industrial complex and tourism. But I know that there are still some differences. Namely, I'm thinking of like the fact that we don't function as a tribe. And so learning how tribal systems work is still new to me. And so I was just curious if you guys think that there's any like perspectives that I should keep in mind when I'm covering like tribal communities as a reporter, if you had any advice on that.
mean, that's a big question. You know, like I think that there was a question in the chat from Odette about, you know, the different opinions or the different perspectives that exist in communities. And I think often Native people are not given the benefit of sort of deliberative democracy, where we are always expecting Native people to vote or to speak with one voice. And if there's divisions in a community, it's like, oh, there's factions and they can't decide. So we better come in and make the decision for them. But in tribal or First Nation communities, like there's differences of opinions, just like there's differences of opinions in any political community. And that's not really handled with nuance by reporters. And in a Canadian context, we have these imposed tribal governments or band council governments that the federal government established in the early 1920s. But then there's also this underlying sort of authentic traditional government that's in operation. And so you have in the community not only political differences in terms of how we engage with this proposal to develop a pipeline in our territory, but you also have these more inherent almost disputes between how are we going to govern ourselves? Are we going to govern ourselves through these, you know, modern, contemporary, but imposed systems? Or are we going to govern ourselves with systems that we've used since time immemorial? And so that conflict is still playing out. In some cases, like the Helsuk, they've figured out a balance between the traditional governance system and the band council system, but in most communities, that's not the case. So as Native people are like trying to weave their way through and back from colonialism to restore Indigenous land and life, this process is part of that, right? Like redefining who they are politically as a polity, if you will. So I think when covering the politics of communities, I mean, like that's a really important element. And I know that there's so much you can do in 800 words, but I think that's I think something that has not been done well to this point.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just add that my ex-father-in-law is Hawaiian, so my son is Hawaiian. My ex-husband is so crazy because he is Hawaiian and Crow, which is, yeah, a really weird combination, right? We have a landlocked mountain tribe, but they met in the military, right? But anyway, I think the important thing to know is that we see Hawaiians as fellow Indigenous peoples, right? We know that you have a language, you have a history of colonization by the United States, and that your struggle to determine your political future as a people in Hawaii is very real and alive, and it's in some ways a source of more hope for you than for those of us who are already stuck in that federal tribal paradigm, or that federal recognition paradigm. So you guys have the potential to maybe create something that will work better, if you know, if all of the things ever align. But yeah, that we see you as a sister in our communities. And I think that's important to know when you go forward, that our peoples are related in a lot of ways, and that's something that we can't describe in words, but it gives you the unique perspective and an understanding of some of those basic concepts, hopefully, that will empower your reporting in ways that will make it really meaningful and really beneficial. You know the values from your own people that we have for land and water, and that, you know, these are finite resources for our people, and they're also our relatives, and that, you know, there's that in places like Ute Mountain Ute, right, where we have, you know, a small reservation and a tribe that really struggles economically for so many things, right? That the fight for sovereignty, the fight for water is just this decades-long intergenerational struggle for them. And I think that the perspective of your people in your community will inform that in ways. So don't be afraid to rely on that, and don't be afraid to utilize that as something that makes your reporting even stronger and gives you a unique voice.
Thank you. Mahalo nui loa.
All right, thanks, Heather. Odette, you had a question.
Yes, and I've refined it as I've been listening. So that's the good news. Yeah, I would love to hear Hayden speak about, I guess I'm looking for a hopeful like throw me a bone kind of a thing, because I'm thinking usually in terms of specifics, specific nations or projects or even individuals. But I would love just to hear a wider lens. And how often do you think it is the plant people, the knowledge keepers who are invited to those tables? When it comes to consulting and resource projects and partnerships, I would just love to hear if that is happening.
I think it's happening more often through informal processes. Like, we talked about a handful of examples in the red paper where communities are doing things outside of the formal channels and processes. Because I think what happens is when these critical land use decisions are being made, communities go out and they hire the lawyers, they hire the consultants, they hire the biologists, the wildlife biologists, they hire all the technical expertise. And then those voices of those folks that have the Indigenous knowledge are sort of sidelined. But one of the things that I think we see, and it is just objectively happening more often, is mapping protocols. So communities are doing community mapping projects. So often the community will map its traditional land use area, and then they'll bring in land users, people that are hunting, people that are gathering, people that are on the land for whatever, like sweating, anything. And these are the people that are going out there and taking stocks of how much white pine there is. They're taking stocks of what the caribou population is. They're the one closest to the ground, and they're the best to say the health of the land. And so those people are being brought into mapping exercises and saying, okay, this is a hunting spot, this is a camping spot, this is where these resources are. This is where the berry patch is, so to speak. And I think the Inuit did this when they set aside their land in the modern treaty. They set aside their own lands that were sacred spaces. Government wanted them to set aside lands that they would exploit for mining later down the road. But they were like, well, we're not really interested in that. So we're going to choose our sacred spaces, and we're going to have that written into the treaty. So I think that in some ways you are seeing it, but it's more often than not. Well, I don't know if I can say it's more often or not, but I think that most of the processes exclude those people. I think most of the processes exclude those people because they're technical, economic, policy discourse that a lot of these folks don't have the language to deploy or access. And their knowledge can be distilled and cherry picked and sort of, look, we're going to smudge before a meeting and land acknowledgement and like medicine wheel, blah, 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 blah. But as an authentic, legitimate value system, they're often not included. But all that being said, I do think that there are processes, one of them is mapping, where those views and that expertise is being included in a real way.
All right, thanks, Hayden. Ashley, you had a question for Heather?
Yeah, I have a follow-up for when you were responding to Deborah's question and you were talking about the reconciliation process in California. I was just curious if other states were working on something like that, if you knew of any, or if there's already a process that's happening in other states similar to it.
I'm not aware of any. Maine went through a reconciliation process with the federally recognized tribes there. I don't know if it was a comprehensive process that involved non-recognized tribes. But no, I'm not aware of anything like what California is doing elsewhere. It's very possible there is, but I don't know about it.
According to the chat, Washington is in the early stages. Thanks, Anna.
And one insight, if I can add, since we're a little bit further along the reconciliation pathway, our national truth and reconciliation report is almost 10 years old now. And it proposed 94 recommendations, calls to action, and by our count, only 13 have been implemented. And it's actually kind of tricky to get the media to report on that. It's like, let's celebrate these calls to action, and Canada's actually doing something, but then you realize, 10 years later, they're not actually doing anything. So like getting the reconciliation process started is in some ways the easy part. It's like the implementation of reconciliation, whatever that is. That's the hard part, and that's the accountability work that I think a lot of Indigenous people need support with.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Juliet, I managed to make it to you. This is going to be the last question. I'm doing this for your own safety and sanity, journalists, because we have a lot of Zoom watching ahead of us and we need to take a break. So, Juliet, go for it.
Thank you. Thanks, both of you. Really appreciate it. I have the good fortune of living in Southern Oregon. I'm curious, Heather, I really appreciated what you said about understanding history and especially the history that preceded colonization. I'm curious what resources that both of you might recommend. Could be anything like a book, course, anything that would help deepen our understanding.
Well, I think it's always great to begin with the people that you're working with in your research or your reporting. If you're working on a story about a specific nation, talk to leadership. As other people have suggested, don't just stop with leadership, right? You're elected tribal government representatives. Most tribes at this point, or many tribes at this point, have tribal colleges. Go to the tribal college, talk to the folks at the library. Most tribes with the tribal college have a tribal archive, or some tribes don't have a tribal college, but they have a tribal museum and archives. Those are all great resources, and I can encourage you strongly enough to talk to the folks who are staffing those types of institutions. If there's a tribal archive, that's where you go to find out more about comprehensive and balanced accounts about the tribe's history and its political relationships with colonizers and the history of the lands encompassed by the tribe. And those are the most important sources in my book. You can look for an overarching view if you're looking at law. You're going to hear from two of the best legal experts in the federal Indian law realm later today, I believe, Professor Fletcher and Professor Kevin.
Yeah, Washburn. Yeah.
Washburn. Thank you. Yeah, my cold meds are kicking in. But yeah, so, they're both authors of a number of articles that are really great, especially Matthew. He's a prolific writer. And, look in the footnotes. If you find something that's, sort of a surface treatment of an issue, go to the footnotes and see what, other sources might be there and that other people are building off of. So those are a couple suggestions I have.
Hayden, any extra
There's
thoughts on that?
there's a great little organization based out of Toronto called Yellowhead Institute. They've got you covered for all your stuff.
Awesome.
Mostly Canadian content.
When it
And
comes to treaties, though, I want to give a plug for the University of Arizona. My institute, the Rogers College of Law, has hosted a number of really important treaty studies from here in the United States. So we have a wealth of research by people like Vine Delory and others who are really, at the forefront of looking harder at treaties and understanding what they really meant from an early era. And our archive, our library here at U of A, has a lot of publicly available information on those issues as well.
Great. Thank you both. And just so everybody knows, we have been posting some of this stuff in the chat. So the red paper on land back and the Minesweeper map and some other things that were mentioned, but we will be collecting all of that and sharing it with you along with the speaker contact information after this, so that you have those resources easily accessible. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of the questions. You will definitely be able to email these folks. They're very responsive. We can guarantee that they'll get back to you and want to engage with you. I am going to leave this room open, but we will see you guys again in about 42 minutes for our session on reporting in Indigenous communities with Graham Lee Brewer. And again, sorry, journalists, we couldn't get to all of your questions, but I will definitely get you a way to ask them of Heather and Hayden. And Heather and Hayden, thank you so much for joining us. Now is when we do our patented IJNR golf clap. Everybody, this is your round of applause for taking time out of your busy lives to help a bunch of journalists get their heads around these issues and think about better ways of reporting on them.